Hi, thank you. My talk is called Understanding Spoon Theory and Preventing Burnout. First, I want to introduce myself just a little bit. My name is Jameson, but you can call me Jamie. I'm here from the city of Buffalo, New York, unfortunately, which is famous mainly for bad weather. Very excited to be here. I'm representing Agrilist. That's the company that I work for. We're an agricultural startup in New York that does farm management and data analysis for indoor farms. I'm also a panelist on Greater Than Code, which is a podcast about code, and more importantly, the people who write it. And I have stickers. If you want some, find me later. And you can follow me on Twitter at Jamie Bash. There's one other thing about me that's pretty important that I kind of wanted to get out of the way right at the beginning. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. I'm transgender. Specifically, I'm genderqueer or non-binary. Either term is fine for me. And if you're not familiar with those terms, that means three main things. Number one, that I don't identify as either male or female. Number two, I use gender-neutral pronouns they, the singular they, so please keep that in mind when referring to me. And number three, it also means that I have really great hair. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I kind of wanted, that's an important thing that I like people to know about me. But what I actually came to talk about today is spoon theory. Well, what is spoon theory? Essentially, it's a social metaphor that refers to the amount of energy we have in a day to do things, where the spoons are the unit of measurement. Spoon theory was coined in an essay in 2003, written by a woman named Christine Miserandino, who has lupus, and she made this metaphor to describe what it feels like to have a chronic illness, which is kind of hard to understand if you haven't experienced it. And the key here is that you have a finite number of spoons. If you use that energy for something, you've spent that unit of measurement, you've spent that spoon. And when you talk about spoon theory in terms of like physical disability, it's important to consider that it's different for different people. Like for instance, there are some people with disabilities that certain things they just can't do. If you're a full-time wheelchair user, you probably can't take the stairs. And the converse of that, no one's probably going to expect a full-time wheelchair user to take the stairs. But it's not always quite as easy to identify as that. Like maybe someone has a prosthetic leg and you've seen them take the stairs, and then on another day they can't, and you might not even know that they have a prosthetic, and that might make it a lot more tempting for you to say something like, well, I saw you do it before, why can't you do it now? But you don't actually know how much energy it takes for them or how difficult it is for them to do that. So you can't really know how many spoons someone else has just by seeing them. And I mentioned that they were finite, so in theory that means you can run out. Well, what happens if you run out? Well, they're gone. And if you really need to, sometimes you can borrow spoons kind of from your future self, but there's consequences to that. And I like to think about that in terms of video games. I really like video games. I think a lot of people do. This is Stardew Valley, one of my favorite games, because all I ever think about is farming. But as you can see in the corner, you have this little energy meter, and it's green because you just woke up, and you have energy for your whole day, and you do stuff, and now it's yellow. And you do more stuff, and it's orange, and now it's the end of the day, and you're in the red. So at this point in the game, if you went to bed, you would wake up the next morning, and it would be green again, and you could go about your day. Or you could stay up and do more stuff, and it will let you go down below the bottom of the meter. But if you do that, then when you wake up the next morning, you're not at full. And that can be a huge burden if you have a lot of, farming or other non-farming chores to do. So who does spoon theory really affect? I think everyone can benefit from an understanding of spoon theory. Christine Miserandino kind of talks about how healthy people have an unlimited number of spoons. I don't think that's quite true because spoons are energy and nobody has unlimited energy. But the idea is that like a healthy person probably has enough to get through the average day without having to ration it. But I also don't think it's just the disability and physical illness communities that can benefit. The mental illness community also uses spoon theory now as a communication technique. And I also think it's really useful when considering what it's like to be part of like a minority or marginalized group and experience discrimination. So it gives us a shared language. I think that's a really important key factor of it. Like it's hard to go up to someone, say your boss, and say something like, I'm having these health issues, I had a panic attack today, like that's a hard conversation to have. But if you can say, I just don't have the spoons to do that today, you can kind of get across a very complex idea more easily. It gives us a greater empathy for others because we're thinking about what other people might be going through. And it gives us a better understanding of our own limits, which I think is really important for everyone. But I want to talk about those kind of 3 communities that I mentioned and go into a little bit the different ways that they might be spending spoons. Again, this is going to be different for every individual person. People with different illnesses from other people are going to have different needs, but this is kind of an overview. So people with physical illnesses and disabilities, being in constant pain is really exhausting. We do so many things every day that we don't even think about. They're second nature to us, but if you have chronic pain, all of those things become really difficult. Personally, I've struggled with chronic back pain, not enough to say that I have a physical illness or disability, in my opinion, but it made me realize how much I was taking for granted when I wasn't having chronic pain. The emotional drain of worry is also something that can be very on your mind and very tiring. Reduced mobility, again, is making it harder to do everyday things and go places. And frequent healthcare. We think about healthcare as something that's important to manage our health, which it is, but it can also be very tiring. Think about someone who's undergoing chemo. That's taking a lot of their energy and a lot of their spoons. Mental illnesses are similar in many ways because people who have mental illnesses are chronically ill, but society doesn't really treat it the same way, so it's kind of important to discuss it differently, I think. This is obvious to me, but constant emotional distress is also really exhausting. There's this perception that people with mental illnesses should pull themselves out of it and get over it. And that's a huge burden because it's taking that burden and putting it back onto you, saying, you need to minimize your own suffering or your own pain for everybody else. And it can also kind of cause this second guessing of people's right to be sick. If people tell you that they think you're faking it enough times, you might start to feel like, oh no, maybe I am faking it, or it's some sort of failing rather than an illness. And mental illnesses can also have very physical components too. It's not just all in someone's head. Personally, I suffer from anxiety and panic syndrome, and panic attacks are pretty much the most physical, intensive, tiring thing that I experience in my life ever. They can be very scary if you don't know what you're witnessing. I look like I'm having a seizure or a stroke, heavy breathing, hyperventilating. I get very hot. My heart rate is very high, so it's not just a thing that plagues only the mind. It can be the body as well. And again, marginalized groups, I think this is less common to apply spoon theory to, but it's pretty relevant in my opinion. It turns out being discriminated against sucks really bad. And when you're discriminated against every day, you're starting your day from a place of fatigue, which is a lot what spoon theory is about. Watching the news every day and seeing bad news is very emotionally tiring. This is true for everyone, I think. I'm American, so it's very true for me at this moment. But it's a lot worse for marginalized people because you're seeing news about a law was passed to legally discriminate against your community. People in your community are getting murdered sometimes, and then people expect you to want to discuss these minority issues all the time, even if you don't want to. Having to justify your existence to other people. As a non-binary person, I spend a lot of time explaining what non-binary means to people, which I don't mind doing because I think it's really important. But often there's this subtext there that says, if I don't do a good enough job explaining it, then they're not going to accept it. And then therefore they're not going to accept me for who I am. So I feel like I'm constantly begging for people's approval. And microaggressions are something I literally give a whole separate talk about, but I'll try to be brief. Microaggressions are basically smaller, less blatant displays of discrimination that if it happened to you once, maybe it would be annoying, like a mosquito bite. But if it happens over and over and over and you're covered in mosquito bites, it gets more and more hurtful. And every marginalized community kind of has their own set of microaggressions. I'm going to give a couple examples so you can kind of know what I mean when I say this. You don't sound black. I think we can all hopefully agree why that's a really crappy thing to say to somebody. You don't look transgender. Okay, sorry, how did you expect me to look? This is for like a lesbian couple. Who's the guy in your relationship? Well, neither of us are the guys. That's what that word means. And I think women in tech will understand this feeling, but, oh, are you the secretary? No, why would you assume that I was the secretary? Why didn't you assume that I was technical if I'm here? So when I talk about them as mosquito bites, like not everyone gets bit by mosquitoes at the same rate, and that's kind of why microaggressions pile up for marginalized people and become very burdensome. So I want to do a quick exercise of like an average morning and where spoons might get spent for different people. So this is like our control group, like you're an average, healthy, privileged person. You get up, you get dressed, you go to work, it's crowded on the subway maybe, you get to work, maybe the elevator's broken, you climb the stairs, and then you're there. So that's pretty much, you got that under control. Maybe you spend a spoon on some of those annoyances, but overall, like you got this, it's fine. But what if you had an illness that gave you chronic pain and you did the same morning? First of all, you may be starting with less spoons to begin with because you couldn't sleep because of your pain. When you get up and get ready, it takes a lot longer. You're in pain while you're doing it. You might have to take a bunch of medications to kind of mitigate that. Maybe they make you feel kind of nauseous, but you're used to it. But you're already spending more energy doing that. If it's crowded on the subway, when people jostle you, it's very painful. But if you don't have an illness that is like very outwardly visible, maybe nobody gives up your seat, and you have to stand. I mentioned that the elevator was out casually in the last example, but if you have a disability, maybe having to use the stairs is a huge burden, but maybe there's no other way to get up to your office. So let's say you spend like 20 minutes climbing the stairs, you have to take a rest, you're at the limit of your pain threshold already, and it's only the morning. That's probably a couple spoons. And now you're late to work, so you don't get any coffee. And you're spending another spoon, realizing how much work has piled up from being late. You had a doctor's appointment early in the week. And now you have a lot less than in the first example. Okay, now we're gonna do it again. It's like a scary Groundhog Day situation where you have to keep living the same day. But now I'm gonna talk about having a mental illness. Again, I'm gonna talk about having anxiety and panic disorder because that's kind of what I know, but it can be different for different people. You're also starting out with less because you had a panic attack last night and kind of went over your capacity and borrowed spoons from today. Getting up and getting dressed on bad anxiety days for me can be really difficult, not in a I don't feel like getting up way, but in a really intense fear of like leaving the house or even leaving my room, but you can't really call off work for intense fear with no source. So you gotta power through that and go on your commute. Whenever people jostle you, maybe your heart is racing, you feel like you're starting to panic. On really, really bad days, you may even feel like a paranoia that people are watching or following or tracking you somehow, which, even if it's not actually true, is a really terrifying experience to think that it's true. By the time you get to work, you're all worked up, and anxiety kind of compounds once you get into that state. Things that would be fine on normal days are very anxiety-inducing. So now you're overanalyzing the tone that people use to say hi to you or the wording and kind of really generic emails. Having a panic attack the day before actually makes you more susceptible to having another one the next day because of a thing called secondary anxiety, which is really stupid. I know that it's stupid even when I'm experiencing it, but I still experience it, which is like I get so nervous that I might have a panic attack that it causes me so much anxiety that I do have a panic attack. So even just worrying about that is kind of spending energy on spoons. If you work yourself all the way up to a panic attack, it's pretty much game over. I pretty much have to sleep before I can do anything else at that point. One more time, only one. I'm gonna talk about the transgender community because that's what I know, again, for marginalized groups. You get up and get ready. Maybe you woke up and you were in a pretty good mood, but then you saw yourself in the mirror when you were like brushing your teeth, and you didn't really recognize the person you're looking at. Gender dysphoria is pretty hard to describe, but imagine if like tomorrow morning you woke up as the opposite gender that you had been your whole life. Every time you saw yourself or heard yourself speak, it's gonna feel wrong. Getting dressed is also kind of a burden. I wear a binder. It's hard to get on, and it's very uncomfortable. So now you're commuting on the subway to work. Someone catcalls you and calls you a freak. You get passively misgendered 4 times by strangers who aren't trying to be mean but don't know any better, and you're not feeling very good. You're reading the news as you pass the time. They passed a law to discriminate against trans kids in schools, and also you find out that a trans woman of color was murdered in your city over the weekend. So now you already weren't feeling good about getting catcalled, but now you're feeling kind of nervous. You get to work and climb the stairs. The receptionist misgenders you, even though you've talked about this with them a bunch of times. You correct them, and they make a comment about how all you ever talk about is being trans. But again, when you think about the metaphor from earlier about waking up as the opposite gender, it's really jarring to hear every time someone gets it wrong, so you can't really not think about it. By the time you get to work, you feel like you have to work harder and speak louder in order to get noticed for anything you're doing, which means it takes more spoons to get the same amount of work done. By the way, this is something that pretty much all women in the tech industry have to experience, which is good to keep in mind. So as you can see, privilege is a major factor. Nobody has unlimited energy. Nobody is the Terminator. Everyone has times in their lives when they have to spend more spoons. Maybe you're healthy, but your mom is in the hospital, and that's really stressful for you. Maybe you had a baby recently, and you haven't slept through the night in a few months. Those are definitely things that are going to cause you to spend more spoons. But the difference between these kind of things and the kind of things from the example are that A, these kind of things are usually temporary, and B, someone who's in one of those categories is just as likely to have to experience something like this on top of all the stuff they have to experience every day. So the key here is, I'm not saying that if you are privileged, you can never have a hard time and your life is never hard. Everyone's lives are hard. But it's not hard because you have privilege. It's hard in spite of that. Well, how does this affect me? And I'm just kidding. I'm not actually accusing anyone here of being like this, although a lot of people are like this, unfortunately. I think it really depends on who you are. If you're in one of those groups that I was talking about, I'm sure you're already managing your spoons every day, but it can feel very tiring to watch other people not have to do it and make you feel like you're kind of weak or a failure. So thinking about it consciously is a good way to talk about self-care. Self-care is really necessary for all of us. I saw a talk last year by a friend of mine, Mary Thengvall, where she talked about self-care as the oxygen mask in a plane. You put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. And thinking about it this way really changed my life, kind of, because I think we're all kind of, it's thought of as a positive thing to sacrifice your own well-being to do things for others, especially in the tech and startup industry. Being a martyr, working too hard and sacrificing other things is seen as a real badge of honor. But it turns out that we can't really do our best at anything unless we take care of ourselves first. And when I talk about self-care, a lot of people, I think, picture this, and sometimes it can be like this, but other times it can be more like this. On days when I can and I have the energy for it, self-care can mean holding myself accountable, getting stuff done that needs to get done. On days when I don't have as many spoons, maybe self-care means giving myself permission to rest and forgiving myself for not getting everything done. So I think the key is to kind of be able to tell what you need in a certain moment. If you're not in one of those groups, but you are an employer or a manager, I guarantee you that some of your employees are struggling with this. So, you saw, I hope the morning exercise kind of showed how important it is that, in the morning when you expect your employees to be refreshed and ready for the day, they've already spent a lot of spoons, and that is definitely a problem, and affects productivity. But it doesn't just affect productivity, it affects people's entire lives. Hopefully you care about your employees and you want them to lead fulfilling lives, and if they're spending all their energy getting to work and doing work, that's really destroying their work-life balance. And this kind of thing leads to burnout. Those are supposed to be fire emojis, sorry. All right, so maybe I've convinced you. You're like, Jamie, I totally understand now, I'm in, but what am I supposed to do about it? You're describing problems that I can't fix for my employees, and that's true. Nobody expects you to fix these kind of major societal things or people's illnesses, but you can lessen people's burdens, and spoon theory is all about burden. Realize that their health is more important than their work. They realize that the reason that this martyr stereotype gets so pervasive is because a lot of companies encourage that. But it's not healthy to expect your employees to think of their work as the most important thing in their lives. It shouldn't be. Adequate healthcare is kind of more of a US issue, actually. But it's not just managing our health, it's also managing the expenses that come along with being sick and the stress. Having peace of mind about that also conserves a lot of energy. Treat mental illness as an illness. If you see someone who's freaking out and you think like, oh, they're freaking out about nothing, let me let you in on a secret. That's more of a burden on them than it is a burden on you, I promise. They're not faking it. And make accessibility a priority, because nobody wants to be an afterthought. You're gonna make your employees the most safe and comfortable if you can address some of these things before they have to come to you to ask for things specifically. When I say accessibility here, it can mean all sorts of things, including access to your building and all of its facilities, appropriate bathrooms, which is important both for people with disabilities and for the trans community, transportation considerations, and also when you're planning events, keeping in mind, not everyone can do physical activities, people have different diets, can't have alcohol, and not planning your events around things like that means something to people. It's really all about keeping people's needs in mind. And considering that fare isn't always equal. You may not want to be seen as giving special treatment to certain people, but if people have illnesses or other things that are affecting their lives, sometimes they need considerations just to perform on the same level. For instance, if someone is sick a lot, they maybe are late to work more often or miss more work. If you're more lenient with them, that's not really special treatment. That's just something that they need to be able to do their job effectively. And also keeping this in mind when you're looking at people's work and their productivity. If someone is less productive than someone else, it's not necessarily because they're not as smart or not as hardworking. There could be barriers in their situation that's causing that to happen. There's been this trend recently that I've noticed where a lot of men are writing think pieces about like, I pretended to be a woman in tech, and I didn't believe sexism was real before, but now I do. And it's kind of annoying to me because I wish they would just believe women's experiences like the first time. But it is kind of relevant because it's highlighting this idea that people can have barriers that you don't even know about because you haven't experienced them. So in this case, this guy switched names with one of his colleagues and noted, Nicole had the most productive week of her career. I realized the reason she took longer is because she had to convince clients to respect her. So he learned some empathy by doing that experiment. Company culture and culture fit are phrases that kind of make me cringe sometimes because I feel like a lot of times they're kind of used as excuses for crappy behavior and not being tolerant, a lot of the things we've been talking about. But you can foster a company culture that's empathetic and accepting. So how do you do that? First of all, actions speak louder than words. It's not enough to just say you want a good culture. You have to do things to actually create it. I'd like to tell a story about my first day at my current job. Everybody knew that I was trans. I was out to them, and it was okay, but I was still nervous about it. I'm always nervous when I meet a new group of people with issues like that. And so I was filling out paperwork for our payroll on my first day, and there was a question that was like, male or female, gender, you had to pick one. And I was like, oh, I don't know what to pick. So I emailed my CEO of my company, we're a small company, and I was really nervous about this. I was like, I'm not sure what to pick, I'm not sure what to do. And she wrote me back, and she was like, oh, I'm sorry about that. Like, I don't think it's right that there's only two. And I was like, okay, well, I feel pretty good. Like, she's on the same page as me. But then she said, in fact, I'm going to email our payroll right now and tell them that I don't think it's right that there's only two and that I think they should add more. And I was like, wow. Like, she really cares about this and wants to put her money where her mouth is kind of to protect me. And so I felt really good and safe about that. But don't demand that minorities do all the diversity work. Like, it may feel like a good thing to do if you're like, okay, well, I want to do better. I'm going to ask minorities that I know that work for me how to help educate me and teach me how I could be doing better. But the problem is that like a lot of these people are already struggling to manage their spoons, as we talked about, and doing more free work on top of it maybe isn't at the top of their priorities. I like to say this specifically because I'm kind of an exception. I do a lot of this, and I love to answer questions. I'm always open to answer questions, but I don't want everyone to think that because I am, they can go ask anybody they meet, because it's not really true. But do listen to your employees when they come to you and believe their stories. We have kind of created a culture in tech of people not wanting to come forward with stories of harassment or discrimination because there's this perception that they're not gonna get believed or not taken seriously. And I think the most important way to combat that is to just take people seriously, and I think word will spread. There's a joke I hear a lot about how all women in tech know each other, and that joke is kind of like, well, if you're a jerk and you have bad behavior, word travels fast about that, which is true. But I also think that the opposite is true, that good behavior gets passed along the network as well. And don't tolerate bad behavior. If you say you're not going to tolerate it and then you don't do anything about it, you're just showing, untrustworthiness, or that you care more about appearing like you're doing work here than you actually care about the people that need that work. Inaction also speaks louder than words, and I think it's important to think about what your inaction is saying, and if it's saying the thing you want it to be saying. I think about this all the time. If you're not willing to remove a toxic contributor from your project, you're accepting toxic behavior as a cultural norm. And if that's not something you want to do, it's something you have to consider. I have a little bit of recommended reading. There's a few articles about this. The original Spoon Theory article. There's a video of the burnout talk that I mentioned by my friend Mary Thengvall. If you go on my Twitter, I have links to these slides, and you can find these links. And thank you very much for listening. This is my Twitter, and this is my website. I write a lot about diversity, mental health, ethics issues. Thank you.